Welcome to Dan Lee Boatbuilding. In this video we're going to be getting on with the second layer of the cold molded planking on the Temptress model, which is what you see next to me here. We're going to take a look at what we need to do to the first layer of planking, and then we're going to press on with cutting the second layer of planks. And we're going to look at the vacuum bagging process and how we use that for cold molding as an unparalleled system for clamping those veneers down onto the first layer of planking, which we've already done. So I've done a little bit of work on this already, and that is what you've just seen at the start of the video. I've just faired off the first layer of the planking lightly, and that's just really taking the tops off and just getting out any sort of high spots. Not a huge amount of work to do there, but just flatten that planking out a little bit. The better that the first layer of planking is faired, the better the whole rest of the process is going to go as we lay the consecutive planking layers on. So I've given that a light fair off, and then I've just retransposed these lines back through on the hull again where all the frame stations are, so that we've got them as a reference if we need to put any mechanical fixings through into the structure below. So following on from that, we want to get a good epoxy coating on this first layer of planking, and that's what you can see here. So we start by mixing up some epoxy. We're using the West System 105 resin and the 206 slow hardener for this process. We want a little bit of extra working time with this because it might take a bit of time to get all those planks placed, and especially if you're working in semi-warm conditions, you need a bit of working time. So we'll get some of that mixed up. Initially, we're just using unthickened epoxy for this coating process. I'm going to be applying that epoxy with a West System plastic squeegee, and that just allows me to move the epoxy around the surface of the boat nice and quickly and efficiently, and sort of push it down into the wood grain as well. You could also use a roller for this process, but I quite like the squeegee, and we're going to be using that when we get to applying the peel ply over the top of this as well, which you'll see in just a second. So the plastic squeegee just allows you to move the epoxy around the surface, and by using this kind of technique of angling the squeegee off to one side, you can kind of imagine it like a bit of a snow plow really. So if the squeegee is turned, say at 30 degrees or something like that, the epoxy is going to run off to the trailing edge of that squeegee. So you're actually able to sort of go back and forth and progressively push the epoxy around the surface and distribute it nice and evenly. So you can see that that is what I'm doing here. We're getting a good coating all the way over those veneers and right down onto the chine flats as well, which is the area that we want to seal in with our vacuum bag. So we're probably doing about 3 coats of that. Certainly on the full boat, you're going to want to be doing 3 coats of epoxy just to get a good seal, and wait for that first coat just to start to tack up a little bit before you go on with the second coat. Then we are getting on to applying the peel ply. Now this is a piece of peel ply here, and it's very similar to a sort of fine fiberglass fabric, like the sort of thing that you would expect to see for the fiberglassing process. But this is a nylon fabric, and it's treated quite often with a release agent. So the idea behind this is it's actually a sacrificial layer that gets applied into wet epoxy, and then it's pulled off and removed. There's a couple of functions to that really. It's going to help us to remove the amine blush. So when an epoxy cures like this, it emits an amine blush, which is a waxy substance that comes to the surface of the epoxy. That needs to be removed before you can then carry on with any other bonding or finishing operations over the top of the epoxy. So we want to remove that. There are a couple of ways that you can do that. You can wash it off with some washing up liquid or detergent, something like that, and some warm water, or you can use a process like the peel ply. Now, because we're actually going to pull this off and remove this afterwards, it's going to take that amine blush layer away with it. Another factor to this is it's also going to prep our epoxy surface so that we are ready to bond straight to it. So we're going to end up with a rough textured finish to this epoxy, so it doesn't need to be sanded before we then carry on with the next planking layer. It's also going to help us to remove any excess resin, so anything that wicks through the peel ply, where we might have an excess of resin in a particular area, we're going to remove that as well when we take it off. So 3 major benefits really to using peel ply for this process, and it's a really good system it's an extra process in the application, but it's really going to help us down the line. So we apply the peel ply in much the same way, in fact exactly the same way that you would do a fiberglass cloth. That gets laid into the wet epoxy resin, and we use that squeegee to push the epoxy through the peel ply fabric and to wet it out thoroughly. Now, you don't need to be too meticulous about the edges with the peel ply. In actual fact, what you want to do is leave a few edges exposed, because we're tearing this back off further down the line. We want to be able to have something to grab hold of to get that started, to peel the peel ply back away afterwards. So what we want to aim for really here is a nice, neat consolidation across the whole surface of the peel ply. We want to get bubbles worked out, and we want to get it nice and evenly laid and flush with the hull, so that we get a good surface finish. And here we can see roughly what that's going to look like after it's been applied. So you can see I've got this kind of skirt that's hanging out around the edge of the boat, and that's what we're going to use to be able to pull this back off again. The skirt doesn't need to be quite that big, but that's just my excess that I was hanging off. And you can see the section up forward there by the keel where we've got a bit of extra, and that's also going to be the start of where we can peel from. So then once the epoxy's cured, we can begin to peel the peel ply away, and it comes away very easily. It's actually quite a nice, satisfying process, and what it should leave behind is this nice, uniform, pre-keyed, amine blush-free surface that we can go straight onto with bonding for our next operation. Okay, so once our peel ply has been peeled, this is what we end up with. So you can see we've got an epoxy coating on the timber surface here, and if we look really closely, we've got this texturing to the surface. Now this means that we don't have to sand this before we bond to it, so we can bond straight to this with our next epoxy planking layer. We've removed any amine blush on the surface because we've taken that top layer off with the sacrificial peel ply, and so we are completely ready to go on with the next layer. So there's a couple of little identifying marks just to point out. Things like this here is an example of just where we've got a little air bubble underneath there, where the peel ply hasn't quite touched the surface, or there's a little pocket of air left in there. That's not a problem. We can just fill that with thickened epoxy when we do the next layer. So we've got a nice layer that's along here. So our planking is only going to come down as far as here, of course, but what we actually want to do is to seal this area along the chine, because that is where the edge of our vacuum bag is going to fit into, and we want to create a seal for the whole surface that our vacuum bag is going to go down onto, which we'll see in a sec. So you can see we've got a few marks here around the sort of stem area, and that's really just down to the nature of it being quite difficult to get that peel ply to lay over the sharp point at the stem. That's perfectly fine. Again, we can just do some filling work in there if we want to correct that, and that can actually be done as we lay the second layer of planking, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. There's a couple of factors here that we need to sort of think about, and that's to do with the scale really. I mean, even just the thickness of the epoxy, you know, this is the same thickness of epoxy here as you would have on a finished full-size boat, whereas of course this is a quarter scale model, and even things like the thickness of the peel ply obviously hasn't scaled down with the model as well, so we're all a little bit disproportionate in that respect. So we're ready to start doing the next section of planking, and we're going to start again in roughly the same sort of section. I'm probably just going to start around about here actually, and I'm going to show you vacuum bagging this whole aft section of the boat. So first thing to do is to get another set of planks cut. So very similar process to the way that we did the first layer of planking, but of course with this layer we're going in the opposing 45-degree direction. So we're going to be running our planks this way and creating a nice bond that is going to go across the grain of all of the planks that we did in the aft 45-degree direction. So first thing we need to do is to cut a set of those planks and get them positioned and marked out and done the same way that we did the first one. So we'll get a set of those cut, and then we'll see how we go from there. Okay, so there we go. We've got our first layer of planking cut, and the process was exactly the same as the way that I did this before. So we're beveling off the back side of these planks down here, and then we're matching them up into the when we do the second side of the planking, we're matching that into this. And as you can see, I've dry fit everything, so this is just taped in place. I was initially thinking about maybe some little pins or something, but actually the masking tapes worked quite well. What I'd normally do on a full-size boat would be to temporarily screw these or possibly staple them, and that's the real reason for keeping these lines marked through here, so that if we want to staple into the frame line, you can do that. There's plenty of keel in this area, so you could quite feasibly staple just into the keel and into this chine log as well. But for now, because we're just dry fitting, we just want to tack these in place really. And actually the tape works pretty well for that, so that's fine. And then you can see that I've got everything marked up, so I've got all the plank numbers marked up, I've got lines on here, and then I've drawn a couple of lines on the hull underside as well. So we've got a line here where the planking starts, and then I drew one around about the middle, so I think something like this plank has got a mark on the hull. And that's just going to help me to make sure that all of this goes back in the same place, because all of this is going to come off now, and then we'll glue up and then we'll put it all back in. But we want to have all of this pre-fit and aligned and spiraled and everything, so that when we glue the surface, we can put all this planking straight back in without any issues, and make sure that it all goes back where it should do. Okay, so just a little bit of insight into what's actually going on here. You would be inclined to think that the vacuum bag is actually sucking this planking down, but what it's really doing is reducing the atmospheric pressure that's inside of our bag system, and therefore the pressure that's on the outside of that bag has the tendency to pull inwards and create a compression. So we get an even compression on this entire structure here from the outside. And if we reduce that pressure to as much as -1 bar, which is a true full vacuum, that equates to 1 kilogram of force per square centimetre. And that's a huge amount of clamping force. If you imagine that we've got a kilogram over every single centimetre of planking that we've got here, when you're talking about doing this on a full-size boat, that's actually tons of force. Now, that force isn't really a sort of a damaging force to the boat, because you might think, Christ, I don't want to put 10 tons of force on the bottom of this boat. But what that's actually doing is it's applying that force equally from the outside of the enclosed vacuum area. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can do vacuum bagging. You can do it with what we call an envelope, where you as the name suggests, you make a complete envelope and you slide a part inside, and then you've got a bag on the underside of that part, you've got a bag on the top side of that part, and the whole thing squashes down like that and compresses your piece. Now, what we're actually doing with the boat here is that we are creating the bottom side of that envelope with the planking layer 1 that we've already done. And that's the reason that we need to seal this layer with epoxy, because this actually needs to be airtight so that we don't pull any air through it. If we pull air through that wood grain in the planking layer 1, we're not going to get a good vacuum. We might not get a vacuum at all, and so we're not going to be able to pull down our planking layer 2. It's not really possible to do the envelope type process with the boat, because that would actually involve having to put a bag under all of this framing here and put it in one big bubble, and then you pull it down, and then you'd actually want the bag would want to be going in and around all the frames and things like that. You also couldn't do it because of the strong back, so that's not really feasible in this scenario. So you would use the envelope process for something like if you were just veneering a small piece of plywood, but for something like a boat, this is the way that we want to do that. So we've got one side of our vacuum envelope, which is the bottom of our boat, and this is the reason that we've gone with the epoxy resin over the chine. So that is going to be our border. What we're going to need to do is to create a border that we can set up the vacuum bag on and then pull it down so we can get a good seal. And the existing planking layer 1 is 1/2 of that seal, and now we're going to create a border around the outside. So we've got planking for all this area, and we need to now create a bag that is going to go over the top of that. So this is the bagging film that we're going to be using. There are a number of different types of bagging film that you can use, and most of them, to be honest, are smooth. But what we have got here is a perforated vacuum bagging film, and what that's going to do is allow the vacuum and the air to travel through all these little channels. Because these perforations in the bag are loads of tiny little triangles, what they're going to do is sit against the surface here and create loads of little channels all over the top surface of our planking, and that's going to allow our pump to pull air through all of those little grooves and keep the bag away from the surface. If you use just a plain flat bag, like a polythene bag or something like that, it's going to pull down, particularly in the vicinity of the vacuum inlet, and it's just going to suck to the surface in that area, and you're not actually going to pull a vacuum from everywhere else within the assembly. The way that you get over that with different types of films is that you use something called a breather fabric, which is like a sort of flat cotton wool fabric, and that would go in between this and the planking and allow the air to travel all throughout the surface and pull in a good vacuum, an even vacuum across the whole surface. The good thing with this bag is that we don't need to do that, so we just use one bagging product, and it minimizes our waste and consumables within this process. This is designed specifically for decking and cold molding and things like that, so it's a good product to use. So we're going to get a section of this cut out to cover our shape that we're going to be vacuum bagging, and we'll start to get that stuck in place. Okay, so that is our bagging film cut and roughly placed. Doesn't matter that it's nice and oversized. In actual fact, you want a little bit of extra spare there because you want plenty of bag available to pull down, and we'll see how that goes in just a second when we get to that stage. So that is our film ready. Then what we need to do is to stick that to the hull, and we need to create a border all the way around the outside of our planking that is going to create an airtight seal, and the way that we do that is with a bagging tape. So this is a sort of rubberized double-sided tape. You can see it's got paper on one side and it just pulls off the roll like so. So I'm going to get that taped up. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got. We've got our border that runs along here just in front of our forward planks. We're running along our chine here, and then we go off the transom and back down and along the back here. Now this is the reason that we've peel plied and epoxy sealed right over the back here. We need to have a border that we can put our tape onto so that we can get a good seal. Now you'll notice that what I've got here on the transom is a little part sticking out, and that's what we call a pleat. And what that's going to allow me to do is to bring the vacuum bag along and out and create like a little sort of pinch in it effectively. That's just going to give me a bit more bag to work with, because what you don't want to do is to stretch this bag too tightly. You actually want to have plenty of space and bag available so that it's going to pull itself in and it's not going to be stretched too tight in any one place. So we've got a little pleat there, and that's just done by running the tape out and around on itself and then back in. Size of it doesn't really matter. So I've done that one in the actual tape that's on there in that position. What I'll probably do is I'll probably put one around about the middle of each side here, and then possibly up in the center as well there. And they're easy enough just to add in after you've taped your border as well. So we'll just put one up in the center there and you can see what that goes like. So all we really need is just a short section of tape. And what we're going to do is just fold that over on itself. And then just fold out two little legs as well, like that. And then we'll peel back the paper on this side, and then we'll just stick this in place in the center here. And that's going to give us a little arch here. So what we'll be able to do is create a little peak in the bag that will run all the way down the center line of this, and it's just going to give us some excess bag up here that can pull in and make sure that we've got enough in place there. So a real key thing to remember with this process is to try and get everything ready to go before you start mixing up your epoxy. From the minute you mix that epoxy, the clock is ticking and you need to get everything in place. You need to get all of these planks back placed, get the bag in, get it sealed, and then get a vacuum pulled before that epoxy starts to cure. So a couple of things you need to consider with that. You need to consider the temperature that you're working in. So, you know, look at the pot life of your epoxy and consider how much you're mixing up in one time and the temperature and how that's going to affect that. Think about how quickly you might be able to get this placed. So if you're working on your own, you might not be able to do an area this big. You might only be able to do a couple of planks at a time. And we'll look after this, we'll do a section which is just literally one plank. So you can do big areas, you can do small areas, and you can vary that based on how many guys you've got working on the boat or how hot it is, and therefore how quickly your epoxy is going to go off. It's quite cold in here at the moment. It's only about 14 degrees. So I'm going to have plenty of working time, and obviously I'm on quite a small area because this is a model boat. So consider all of those factors. Get everything that you need ready and make sure that you are ready to just have a nice smooth run of everything when it comes to mixing your epoxy. So we've got all of our borders taped, we've got all of our planks sized and taped and then marked up so that we can just take them out and then load them back in. What else do we need to do? We've got our bagging film done. So what we can do now is start to strip this down. So we want to make sure that we keep all of these planks in order so that we can just take them out sequentially and then load them back in once the area has been epoxied. So I'm going to do that now. Start with number 10, and I can just use the boat to load these out down this side so they're not going to go far. Keep them in the same direction so that I can just put them back in, because it can get a little bit stressful once the epoxy is mixed and the clock is ticking. But as I say, if you're not that confident doing this process, then just reduce the amount that you're doing in one go. Just do a couple of planks at a time if you wish. And the other thing is, if you're not that confident about pulling a proper vacuum, so if you've got potential porosity in the first planking layer and you're not actually going to get a proper vacuum pulled, the chances of that happening is going to be greater over a bigger surface area. So if you reduce the size that you do in any one hit, then that's going to reduce your chances of issues as well. So let's get these taken off. Now, because the first plank is quite critical to how all of this is going to go back where we've just taken it off, I've just marked a line up either side of that plank so that I know that that can definitely go back in the right place, and hopefully everything else will then follow. Okay, so the planking is off. We've got our tape set, we've got our bag cut, and the planking's all laid out here nice and neatly in sequential order, so we can start with plank 0, lay them back, and we'll be nice and efficient with getting them placed, hopefully, once the epoxy's on. So let's take a look at the vacuum pump setup. So this is what we've got. This is the vacuum pump, and you can see you've got a control on the front here for pressure. So that just allows you to control how much vacuum you're pulling. Then we've got a gauge on the top there, and then the inlet pipe which runs round and through and into this, which is a catch pot. Now this isn't essential for this process. This is probably used a little bit more resin infusion, but I like to have it just in case as a precaution. So what this does is, this is the inlet vacuum which is going to come from our boat lamination, and it goes into this pot, and then you can see this top section here just has an open pipe, and then this is what goes off to our pump. So it just creates this holding pot effectively, and there's a little paper cup down inside there, and all that does is it's just a, well, as the name implies, a catch pot. So if you by any chance get any resin come out of your layup over here and go through your pipe work, what it does is it comes down and it drips down into this cup in the bottom, and it doesn't feed up through into your pump. The last thing that you want to do is be pulling epoxy resin into your nice vacuum pump, because it will ruin it in short order. So this is a bit of a protection device really that prevents that from happening. As I say, the chances of us pulling any resin up through this are quite unlikely with what we're doing here, but I like it as a precaution, and I therefore have my vacuum set up to just include it. So the pipe that comes off of that then splits into two, and that is because I just more often than not I run two of these little fittings that go into the bag. So this goes into the bag, and this allows the pump to pull free air through these channels from within inside your bagging film, and they split open like this, and they just go through a little hole. So this is on the outside of the bag, and then this goes on the inside up against your planking surface. That splits the two connectors which go to those two, which we'll put through the bag when we get it in place. So that's the setup. We're all ready to go. We'll get some epoxy mixed, I think. Now, due to the model size nature, I'm going to deviate ever so slightly here. So this is obviously completely sealed with unthickened epoxy already. On the full-size boat, what you would do here is to wet out the underside of these planks with unthickened epoxy, which would get rolled onto those, and you would then apply a layer of thickened epoxy to this surface with a notched spreader or something like that, which is going to give you a little bit of gap filling. So you see we've got the odd kind of little pocket and things here. We've got a little bit of bumpiness to the surface. That's fine, we can get over that with some slight thickening agent. So we would thicken that with something like the West System microfibers, apply it to this surface with a notch spreader, and then wet out the underside of the veneers with an unthickened epoxy. Now, I'm not going to wet out the veneers with unthickened because these are only 1.5 mm thick anyway, and because I'm just doing a model, I really don't need to be quite so thorough as I would be if I were doing a full-size boat. So I'm going to get a fairly wet mixture of thickened epoxy on the hull here, and then we'll just go straight on with the planks. So I'll get that mixed up and we'll start getting to work. Okay, so I've got my epoxy lightly thickened with microfibers. I'm going to get that on the surface. And then distribute that with a notched spreader. Now this is probably a little thick for the scale really, but it's about as fine as I can go with a notch spreader, I think. So with having that line marked on the first plank, that also shows me where I need to go up to with the epoxy, which is helpful. And then I'm just going to go up to the keel line, but not over to the second side yet, so I can still tape those planks in place temporarily. Okay, so I've got a nice even distribution of the epoxy, and I can start placing my planks now. Now, because these are so thin to a degree, they might actually just stay put just by sticking them into the epoxy. But there are a number of ways that you can do this on the full-size boat. I really highly recommend using some of the Raptor plastic staples, and you can just knock a couple of staples in each of these planks. You only need enough just to pin them in place really, because the vacuum is going to do the job of the actual clamping and pulling these down to where they should be. So you just need something to tack them in place temporarily, and the Raptor plastic staples are perfect because you can just sand straight over the heads of them afterwards and get them out of the way. You can also use metal staples, but you're going to need to remove them if they're steel ones, or possibly stainless. I'm not sure if you can get, I guess you can probably get stainless staples as well. This is actually working quite nicely, just pressing these into place, which is quite a treat. It's helping me to get them in nice and quickly. And just having those frame lines really helps just to get things back in alignment and make sure they're all in the right place, which is good. That's what we want. Okay, side one placed really nicely, so I'm going to get the epoxy onto side two. Again, any of those little voids are just going to get filled at this stage with the microfibers, so you don't need to worry too much about those. Okay, so the planks are tacked in place, and actually, as I say, because this is such thin veneer and the epoxy is quite sticky, these have actually just pushed in place and stayed put, which is a really nice surprise. But I would expect to do staples probably along the keel line and down the chine line as a minimum on each plank to get them to stay put on the real boat. But there we go. So they're all placed. We're now ready to roll out our vacuum bag and get that turned on. So we've got two sides to this bag. Actually, we want to make sure that it's the right way up. So we want to have the little tiny channels to be against the boat so that we're able to let the air transfer through. So we want to make sure that that's the right way around. And we'll get it in place. And I'm just going to start by taping this side. And I think I'm just going to put a pleat in the sides here as well, just to be extra sure that I've got enough bag. And when you tape this down, you want to make sure that you get a nice good seal along that tape. You don't want any little bridges and air gaps in there if you can help it. So you can see that this pleat here is allowing me to get some extra bag up around this area of the boat, and that's what we want. We want plenty of bag that's able to pull in. You don't want to be stretching this tight over the surface. And that's also allowed me to change direction of the bag as well, so that's quite handy if you're not doing long straight runs. The tape might want to try and pull the bag in the wrong direction, so a pleat just allows you to sort of change direction and do a turn with the line of the bag and just change things up a little bit. So it's a good idea to have. So I've taped around this side along this chine and along the transom of the bag, and now I'm ready to put one of our connectors in for the vacuum bag. So we'll grab that, and it just requires a little snip. I tend to just put one in the center of either side of the planking when I'm doing this. So we just want a little snip through the bag to create a hole. And then I need to place my fitting plate on the inside of the bag, and then put this part through that hole, and then screw the two together. And then just place that against the planking. Then I can continue to get the bag taped up. Then I'm just going to place my second connector on this side of the hull. Okay, and then you can see that we've just come along the end of the bag, and we're just sealing off the final little bit here, and we've got this little lump, this little difference between the two. So this is where we're just going to put a tiny little pleat in there, and that's just going to take up, we can just pinch up that excess. Okay, so we're ready to turn the pump on and see what we get. Okay, so you can see that our bag's pulled down. Hope you can hear me okay over the noise of the pump. We've got these little creases and things, and that's fine. That's where we've got plenty of extra bag. What we don't want is it pulled too taut so that it's not going to pull down onto the surface. And you can sort of walk around at this time and you can just listen for air leaks, which you'll maybe get in this sort of vicinity here where you've got a crossover of tapes, and then perhaps on your little pleats as well. So you just want to wander around rubbing those and just checking that they're okay and that there's no hissing noises coming from them. And we've got a good pull down. Now, I've got the pump turned right down, so we're only just starting to pull a vacuum at the moment. And our gauge here will indicate how much vacuum we've got. So my pump will pull round to negative 0.8 bar. That's as much vacuum as that will pull. So that's what we want to be aiming for really. If we've got no leaks in our system, that's where we should be getting to. So we'll turn the regulator up and we'll increase the vacuum. And you can sort of hear the pump load a bit as well. And we'll be applying more and more pressure to that surface. So the reason for starting at the lower pressure is just to allow all this to come down a bit slowly. What you don't want to do is just pull it down really quickly and risk potentially disturbing some of these planks. But once we're happy that they're all landing in the correct place and that things are looking right, we can increase the pressure and the clamp down force. Now, this is where we can see that this is really an unparalleled system for clamping this type of planking. You look at the force that you've got here. If I just get this, pinch this little bit of bag and I lift it, I can barely lift that off the surface, even if I pull it as hard as I can. So that shows you how much force we've got, and we've got an equal force over the entire surface area here. So if you're doing this sort of planking with, you know, little staples, you're only applying tiny little points of pressure all along the planks, whereas this is going to consolidate our whole surface with a huge amount of force. And even with this big pleat here, look, I can barely lift that up off the surface. So I'm really pleased with how that's gone. Just one little check for any leaks that you can normally hear for. Okay, and you can see we're right down at negative 0.8 of a bar, so that is as much vacuum as this pump will pull. So we know that we've got a good seal there. If you've got too many leaks and you're pulling too much air, maybe through your inner planking or through any gaps around the outside of your bag, then you'll see less of a pressure there. And that's a bit of an indication that you maybe need to just go around and check the bag. But if you're consistently pulling maximum pressure for your pump, then it's all good. And you can see that squeeze out of the epoxy here. Look, so where we've got so much force on this, it's firing the epoxy up through that seam in between the planks, and you can see where it's spreading out there. So we're getting a massive hold down there, which is good. So we're going to leave that running till at least the epoxy has cured up, and it doesn't have to be fully cured, but it wants to be cured enough so that we can turn this off and we're not going to have any planks spring back out of position. So we'll leave that running and revisit it when it's cured. Okay, so it's the next day after running the pump. I came back late last night and I turned the pump off when this had enough time for the epoxy to kick and for me to be able to shut it off. And there's one thing that I noticed that had happened there, and we have unfortunately pulled some resin up through these connectors. We didn't get as far as the catch pot, so we didn't actually get any resin into that, but that just shows you that there is a potential for this to happen. And actually I'm glad that that catch pot was there, because had that made it all the way to my pump, I'd have ruined it, which I don't want to do. I think the main reason for that happening is purely the scale of this. Normally I do this on much bigger things, so you know, our planks are going to be 150 to 200 mil wide, and I would tend to position one of these vacuum outlets right in the middle of a plank so that it's less likely to pull epoxy through, where you get the epoxy wick up between the plank seams. And of course we're only doing this on this is 1.5 mil thick planking, so the vacuum is actually, what it's going to do is purge all of the air from within inside this setup, and it's going to draw epoxy through into anywhere those little air gaps are, whether that's between planking or whether that's in the wood grain itself. And because these planks are so thin, we're going to draw epoxy pretty much all the way through those planks, which is why I think we've got some come out and into these outlets. So that's a bit of a shame. We're probably going to have to replace those, but the pump's safe, which is the main thing. So I'm going to get this bag undone and we'll see what's going on underneath. Okay, so to get these outlets off, I'm going to have to heat them slightly to free up the epoxy. We haven't got to get that hugely hot because the epoxy will start to soften at around about 60 degrees C. So we can heat this up to that. We should be able to get them freed. So there we go, look, with just a little bit of warming of the plate, you can see that we've just kind of rubberized the epoxy underneath there, and that hasn't gone as far as damaging the epoxy that's in the hull beneath that plate, so that's okay. Okay, so I've got both of those vacuum outlets off. You can just see the remains of the epoxy there, which we can clean up, that's okay. Timing is something to really think about with this. Ideally what you would want to do is to do this vacuum bagging process, leave the pump running until the epoxy starts to gel up and these planks are no longer going to spring out of place. Then remove the bag and turn the pump off, and then you can begin to clean up. So you see we've got a little bit of excess epoxy here which is just pulled through the planking and sat up against the bag. It's not a massive problem because it's quite nice and flat, and so we can sand that back, we can fare it off fairly easily. But things like the edges here, this is quite a nice thing to be able to do when the epoxy is still rubberized. And what you can do is you could just run a chisel up the edge of here and just square up the edge of this plank. So you can see what we've got here is like a sort of fillet of epoxy now. And what we really want is a nice square edge there so that we can put our next plank into this. That's going to be a little bit more tricky now the epoxy's gone off. And ideally, as I say, you would do that when it's still just sort of rubbery. You can run a chisel up here, clean that up really nice and neatly. I was actually doing this planking last night at around about 7 o'clock, I think I finished, and then I came back at like 10 o'clock to turn the pump off. So I didn't really fancy stripping all this down, doing the video and cleaning up all the epoxy at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, unfortunately. So I'm not in the best position here. I'm gonna have to clean this up with fairly hard epoxy, which isn't ideal. But on a full-size boat, if you can plan properly, that's the ideal way to do this really, is to turn that pump off when your epoxy's gelled and you're happy that it's not going to move any further. So I'm going to do a little bit of sanding, and I'll clean up these edges and stuff, and then we'll take a look at this once I've got this a bit cleaner. Okay, so a little bit of sanding, and there we go. That is our cleaned up layer 2. Really nice glue down on that. We're going to have no voids whatsoever inside those planking layers, and an incredibly strong bond. So that's what we can do with vacuum bagging. Okay, so obviously that is quite a big hull section. You probably wouldn't want to attempt trying to do the whole hull in one go. In theory you could do it, and if you've got enough people to be able to get all those planks in, get the epoxy applied and get the bag on and everything like that, in time you could do the whole bottom all in one section, but you'd have to have a pump that's big enough to keep up with it. My pump could probably just about do a boat this sort of size, full size one, but it's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, so I would personally do it in sections around about this size on the full size boat. You can also do much smaller sections, so if you could imagine that we're going to carry on this process now, you could quite feasibly just do 1 or 2 planks. All you've got to do for that is to just run your bagging tape line over a smaller section. So you just go forward and along the hull up here, and then you'd run your existing bagging tape down the back of this plank here. So you could just do 2 planks at a time if that's a lot more manageable, and that works for you. You could use a faster setting epoxy then, and you know, move the process on quite quickly. So there's a lot of different options. You don't have to do it in this sort of size scale. The pump that I've got is quite a nice pump. It's a relatively expensive pump, but you can get pumps from around about a couple £100. So those are probably going to have a slightly lower volume of air that they can consume over the time. I think you get like a cubic meter per hour volume rating for these pumps. So what that's going to mean is that they'll have less capacity to keep up with leaks. So if the leak is greater than the volume that the pump can pull that through, it's going to struggle to hold the vacuum. So that might be the main thing to consider. So if you want to do this on a slightly cheaper budget and you want to use a cheaper pump, that's fine. I would just recommend reducing the surface area that you're working on at the time. So that is about all we're going to cover in this video. I hope that illustrates the process enough. I'm going to just continue that on down the hull, and I will finish planking layer 2. It may be a little while before I get another video done for Temptress now, because I have got to finish planking layer 2. I've then got to do planking layers 3 and 4 in exactly the same process, and I didn't really think it was much point in kind of showing the making videos of showing that process, because it's just going to be a rinse and repeat of what I've already done. So that obviously is going to take me quite a while to do another 2 planking layers on this boat. I might drop back on the intermediate and do the top side battens, because in actual fact I've gone a little bit ahead of myself here. The top side batten should have probably come before the bottom, but I wanted to get on and get this video done because I know there's a few people waiting to see it. So that's where we're at. Yeah, I'll keep pressing on, and I'll get another video done whenever possible. So hope you enjoyed this one, and I will catch you in the next one. Cheers guys.